Kia ora mai no tātou. Hoi anō tēnei ka mihi atu ki te mano o koutou e whakatau mai nei ki runga i te marae o Ipurangi. Nau mai whakatau mai, tēnā no hoki, ka mihi kauake ki te marae o te mahure i roto o tāmaki makaurau nei, e whakaai mai ana ki mā rātou e manaki tēnei kaupapa. Hoi anō ko hene amaru te tupuna ko Ngāti Hine te hapu, ko hau tēnei e whakatau mai nei i tō tātou manuhiri kai kōrero ko Annette Sykes tēnei. In introducing Annette, I just want to say there's people who you meet along the course of your journeys of life who you know are really special people and who are going to make big impacts. And so I'm really pleased that I'm introducing Annette because she is one of those people. And sometimes we've had good relationships and sometimes not so good, but that makes it all the more interesting. Annette's going to talk to us about structural racism and systemic inequality, Māori nurses' challenge for change. Annette is Te Arawa. She's a graduate of Auckland University and she's been practicing as a lawyer since 1980, specialising in human rights. I really like that part. Specialising in human rights with a strong focus on Indigenous people in promoting tino rangatiratanga and definite advocate for constitutional change. We know there are just under 4,300 Māori practising as a nursing workforce. We need to have Māori nurses in all Māori whānau, and we are interested in systemic issues and making this possible. We look forward to the tribunal claim about Māori nurses, and having been a Māori nurse for some years, I am looking forward to that too. And tēnā koe, Annette, kei a koe te wā. He ora.
Kia ora moi. Kia ora anō tātou I hui mai nei ka raro I te maru o tēnei marae a tāhua. Koutou mā o ngā puhi nui tonu, Ngāti Whātua Tainui Waka, e manaaki nei tēnei whenua rangatira ki tāmaki makaurau a tēnā tātou katoa. I runga I taua tuahuatanga, kei te tautoko au I ngā kōrero I puta I te ata nei, mai ngā tangata rangatira o te tai rāwhiti, a Meng Foon, me ona ake whakaro, ka huri atu au ki o koutou, te kāhui e whakakaukau ngā whakaro e pāna ki te tino kreme o ngā puhi I mua I te tribunal e pāna ki o rātou nei whakaro ki ngā kāwenata tapu, te whakaputanga me te tiriti tēnā koutou, kei te kōtaku nākau, nā te mea ko te whakatau o te tribunal rionga I taua tuahuatanga, kore mātou te iwi Māori I hoatu te mana Māori motu hake ki te krauna. He tika ana tērā o ngā tuahuatanga mai rāno, aha ko tērā kei te moho tātou he whakaro anō wetahi o te krauna I tēnei ao hurihuri, kei te pāpauri au I taua tuahuatanga. Ko tāku nei mihi whakamutunga ki o koutou, te komiti whakahaere o tēnei kaupapa I runga I te rā e kia nei United Nations rā ke whakakorengia te kaupapa te kaikiri ki te kai ngākau o ngā tangata, o ngā mana take o te ao. I runga I taua tuahuatanga kei te mihi atu au ki a koe Heather, ko rō koe tētahi o ngā Pākehā hei hoa mā tātou, I te pakanga mo tēnei kaupapa tino kino, I runga I taua tuahuatanga kei te mihi atu au ki a tātou. Ka huri atu au ki tērā o ngā reo, aha ko tērā kei te moho, ko taku tino moemoea, ko te reo tuatahi o tēnei whenua rangatira, ko te reo rangatira, ko te reo Māori. Mena kei te whai whakaro mātou me pēhea te huarahi tōtika ko te timata me whāngai te reo Māori ki ngā tāngata katoa Māori mā, Pākehā mā, Āhia mā, e noho ana ki tēnei whenua. Hea hai ai, ko te reo Māori I whakarongo ana a tātou nei whaia a Papatuanuku. E whāngai ia I ana tamariki mokopuna mo te aha, kia tiaki, kia manaki I tēnei whenua Aotearoa nei. I runga taua tuahuatanga kei te mihi atu ki a tātou. It would be very difficult for me to start my speech today without recognition of a really important kuia for me who's lying at her home because of the coronavirus, Auntie Kui Daniels. She's a woman from Te Arawa who for a long time lived in the South Island with her husband of Kaitahu, and who inspired me as a young activist to be kind, to be courageous, and to never forget the importance of our teachings of our tipuna. It was really sad for me as we journeyed from Te Arawa knowing that she was someone that wasn't going to be honoured in the way that a wahine rangatira, a wahine māreikura like her should be. Because of course with the kinds of restrictions and rāhui that have been re-established in our world, her whānau and all of the kindness that she epitomised in her life have decided to keep her at their home underneath the cliffs at Arateatea in Horohoro. So I really couldn't start today's kōrero without thinking about Auntie Ka, because she was the epitome of everything that my speech is going to touch on. She challenges those that are unkind to ensure that the politics of kindness that our Prime Minister talks a lot about is used for two things: to undermine the hatred, quite often the white hatred that was imposed on Māori people wrongfully in colonial times, but still persists in modern times, to undermine the sense of dignity that all individuals possess, because fear and hatred quite often dominate a psyche. Fear and hatred quite often, she used to say, born of ignorance and lack of understanding. And someone who also encouraged courage and fortitude during some of the worst times of our Māori history when we've confronted that hatred and that racism. Ka was always there with us in Rotorua during the days of Te Kotahitanga o Wairiki, a group that was set up as part of the Springbok tour efforts by Heart and Care and the leadership of John Minto and the Patu squad here in Auckland. She was a kuia that told us, as small as our rōpū was in the 1980s, there was only 20 of us, that we marched with thousands always, because our ancestors would never have permitted the kind of hatred that was being inflicted around the world based on race to actually survive or even being countenanced within marae. She was a kuia that fought valiantly for the rights of people who had no equal pay in the 1970s and 80s, and she joined the picket lines for the Māori nurses when they actually took their struggle to the streets 2 years ago to highlight the working conditions of Māori nurses and to highlight that the movements, the labour movements, still have relevance in the modern context to challenging that kind of injustice. But more importantly, the power of people to change attitude is as important as the power of the pen to write policy. So moi mai e te whaia. I know that your family, and you've been the creator of beautiful children. I mean, Ra is a great person in the union movement with E2, and your mokopuna Stacey Daniels, she fills the screens every day on our pauaka. So I just want to really pay homage to you, because the kind of intergenerational strength and wisdom that you've given me, you've given your family and Te Arawa and Kaitahu, is the kind of wisdom and thinking we need to permeate all our whānau in this country if we are to achieve the goals of racial equality, of harmony, and to eliminate discrimination, which this day, of course, is dedicated to. For those that are listening, many of you may or may not know that this series of seminars has been developed largely to draw focus to the United Nations attempts to eliminate racism around the world. And I've been fortunate as an activist for the past 40 years to be part of a number of initiatives in that space. Myself and Angeline Grensel travelled to South Africa in 1992 to the World Conference Against Racism, and we were fortunate at that conference to meet up with the late Winnie Mandela, with the late Fidel Castro, with some of the most important activists in the world against racism that still live, like Angela Davis. That conference was an eye-opener for me as a young activist of the kind of reparations and solutions that the world is trying to develop to overcome the ignominy of the discrimination that Indigenous peoples and populations have been suffering for a long time. Sadly for me, as I was preparing for this conference today, I wonder whether the initiatives that we thought about in the last 40 years ago, because that's roughly when that conference, or 30 years ago, have actually had the fruition that we all dreamed and struggled for in that forum. I know that when I was there, I was asking at that time for the establishment of a Human Rights Commission for the Pacific that wasn't going to be dominated by the colonising governments of the New Zealand and the Australian government, that we would actually have the nations of the Pacific able to set up as human rights forums so that we could have some independence to look at the kind of incidences of racism that was being confronted by our communities. Sadly, that kind of initiative has never been crystallised, notwithstanding the efforts of many of us in that 40 years. We have crystallised relationships beyond the boundaries of Aotearoa based on our whakapapa to te moana nui a kiwa, but we've always confronted the spectre of, in my view, racism by the Australian government and the New Zealand government, who have never supported Indigenous nations like the Māori nation having their own voice at the Pacific Island forums. I wonder whether the dreams that I believe we've contemplated, which certainly are sourced in some of the founding documents of our country, like the Declaration of Independence and the treaty, will actually be given fruition ever, because there seems to be the suggestion that colonised governments like Australia and New Zealand, who have yet to, for me, respect the legitimacy of the Treaty of Waitangi as the foundation stone of this country, resist consistently making constitutional change as a high priority on their agendas. Any discussions about constitutional change are always limited, poorly funded, are in a silo effect of human rights discourse, and not actually seen as the basis of the politics of kindness and values that should guide a nation into the future. So I think one of the challenges that I want to end today's discussion with around systemic injustice arising from racism and discrimination within a number of policy areas that impact particularly on Māori, is that we need as a nation to put constitutional change high on the agenda. Māori aren't waiting for the Crown to make that happen. We are relying on the generation of kohanga reo and kura kaupapa children that are now emerging into the world to carry the banner of that fight for independence, of that challenge for liberation, of that desire for the politics of kindness and manaakitanga that underpin the founding of this nation to actually be given true force in the way decisions and power is shared in this nation. I have every confidence as a mother of young men that are committed to that we as a generation of those that fought for initiatives like kohanga, kura kaupapa and whare wānanga are going to see that come to some fruition before 2040, which of course will be 200 years since Te Tiriti was signed. The other challenge that I want is, as part of that, we as a nation need to look at processes of decolonisation that are inclusive, because the nation that we are in this time is quite different to that which was contemplated in the relationships between Queen Victoria and those rangatira who were engaged with by the British Crown and their emissaries in 1835 and 1840. In this modern world, we coexist in our nation with many religions, with many communities, with many people who've come here as manuhiri but have made this place home. And they live here not as manuhiri, but they coexist here as peoples who do care for Aotearoa. The challenge to those communities, though, is does your kindness, does your caring extend to ensuring that those that are the First Nation voices of this country have a say. Not a privileged say, not a minute say, but a fundamental say in the way that the things are organised in this country, that policies are developed in this country, that people coexist in this country, that we plan for the future environment of this country so that we aren't going to be impacted upon by the climate change that threatens to destroy the planet. And I suppose all of you that are listening to me is what she's raving on, because she started out about those things, but it's those big picture things that this day and the next 2 weeks really are asking us to engage about. They're fundamental issues. They're fundamental because they ask us to look at our deep personal relationships with each other, with our neighbours, with people that are strangers to us. They ask us to analyse those that make policies for people without even really knowing those people. And they are challenges that really ask us to look at the crisis of confidence that some people have in the political system. Because one of the things that must be concerning everybody is that no one hardly voted in the local government elections. Generation Z is still distancing themselves from active participation in the politics of the selection of the leadership of this nation. And yet we are all, I think, being very much impacted on by the spectre of the politics of globalisation and neoliberalism, which is actually beyond states' control and in the hands of transnationals who impact on our lives every day. And I think at no time in our history has that better been understood than with the spectre of this virus hanging over our nation as it does today. So for me to start or end a discussion on systemic racism and inequality without recognising the international forces that come to impact on the regional and geopolitical forces that operate to undermine the rangatiratanga of Māori, which in self, in my view, are racist because of the inequities that that system of neoliberalism enforces, I think would be trite. But I want to go from that high-level discussion to where I think is really important in my kōrero today in the time that I wanted to share. In my 40 years of activism, racism has been a central part of a lot of the actions. It inspired my first participation. I was a really shy girl from Kawerau that came back from overseas at the behest of some great leaders to Victoria University at a time when Te Reo Māori was being taught as a foreign language in 36 Kelvin Parade. There was a group of activists at that time that decided to occupy 36 Kelvin Parade, led by the Te Reo Māori Society, and I became enamoured with what those activists did. They were largely gay men that led that activist group, men who, for me, have inspired me all of my legal life and in all of my political life. Sadly, one of them also passed away last year, Lee Smith. But some of them still survive, like Robert Pouwhare and like Timoti Kāretu and like Joseph Terito. And they are all great intellectual minds who aren't the kind of activists that get all the publicity like myself and Hone, but are the real ones that actually put the fire in my belly around something that I thought was nonsensical. Why would they be teaching the native language of this country, the precious taonga that they is, as a foreign language in a university that had been established on foreign land, on our land? You know, it was a troubling thought as a young student. I was 18, but it bore in me a commitment to Te Reo Māori which has never died. I eventually went on to become a lawyer, and as a law student, I wrote the Māori language bill as a paper, as an honours paper for David Williams, Professor David Williams, in my last year, and that then became the basis of the Māori Language Act and the claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, which I was the first Māori woman counsel to ever appear before. So that protest action, based on that racist ideology that Māori was foreign to this land, became a catalyst for one of the most significant changes, I think, in the last 40 years. While I was at Victoria also, I was inspired by the leadership of the great Sir Jackson and his partner, Hannah Jackson, who could not be. They took a Māori language petition. They did things at a time which inspired in ways that my fading memory cannot really capture, with all of the significance that both Sid and Hannah deserve. Sadly, they never both actually got to learn te reo, but their courage to fight for those that didn't have the reo was a source and has been a source of inspiration for me. My love for them led to me changing Victoria University to Auckland University after what happened with the engineering incident. At that time, Hone and Hilda had been confronting those engineering students for the way that they mocked our culture. And so I was inspired to leave a university at that time that didn't even teach Te Tiriti or didn't even acknowledge Māori law as a separate law, to come to Auckland because the catalyst of change that action meant that the university in Auckland was required to challenge its own institutional ignorance and to provide courses around tikanga and at least Te Tiriti. And I challenged the Auckland University while I was there to also set up a marae. One of the things I did at university was I occupied the registrar of the university chancellor. I did, I think, 13 papers in my third year, and I sat in a garage most of those times protesting about why we didn't have a marae to do it. And that, of course, you see a big flash marae that's now established at Auckland University, largely because of that. And we didn't even get invited to the opening. This is all interesting. And again, it was some gay men that was part of that action with me. I want to pay tribute. One's died, is Rangi Chadwick. He sat there with me. And then there was some very strong Māori woman, Donna Gardner. I remember Sharon Hawke, who you're going to hear later on from this afternoon. John Tamihere fed us. I have to say, he did what he does now. He was the one living at West Auckland and made sure that all the students that were in the garage were fed. And a number of other people, Hinamato McNeil from Te Arawa, Tony from Ngāti Awa, and John from Te Aotearoa. There was a few of us, but we made impact. What's the purpose of this? Activism and action have been my teachers to confront racism. Activism and action. It's not just decolonisation processes of education, it's transforming that into action in practical ways. And I want to use these examples because most people think that it's the activists, the high profiles, Tame Iti of the world or the Sir Jacksons. But in my experience, it's the actions and the activism of people that see injustice that have actually made the changes to confront racism that we needed. From that, I then went home to Rotorua to set up, I think, the first Māori law firm. One of my first cases was a terrible human rights breach involving a gun being pointed at Sid and wrongful allegations made against him by the New Zealand Police Force, alleging that he'd done an aggravated robbery, but of course he was placed under house arrest with a gun in his head for about 8 hours. And that was a particular case that took many, many years to resolve. It went right through the Human Rights Commission, and it was a terrible time because Sid and his partner at that time, Deirdre, had just recently been to Libya. So the threat of us and our beliefs by even going internationally was such a perceived threat to the state that acts of terrorism were actually effected against what I would say was one of the greatest leaders of that time, Sid Jackson. A case soon after that one, which still reverberates in my mind, is a case where people had tried to bury a baby without going through the necessary regulations in the health system, and the confrontations that occurred at a marae. Many years later, of course, people will know I was one of the lawyers involved with the terrorist raids that occurred in Ruatoki, Maunga Pohatu, Waiwohau and Te Waimana. I appeared for 19 of the 24 that were charged originally, and I was fortunate to put a legal argument up around the breach of human rights that had occurred in terms of the search and seizure process to enable 19 of those 24 people to be had their charges withdrawn from them. In more recent years, I've taken the individual cases of racism and individual confrontations with the state to the Waitangi Tribunal in a range of cases. One of them, I think the ones that I'm most proud of, which I focused on today, is the Māori nurses one. But I have to mention two other cases which really have drawn attention to the ongoing endemic institutional racism that we confront, and that's at the criminal justice level. That is the cases around the levels of incarceration of Māori in jail. When we started law in 1980, and I want to highlight this, there was only 8% of the prison population were women, and out of that 8%, I think 4% were Māori. When I did the case, can I have some water if someone's got some water? When I did the case in 2 years ago, the numbers had increased so that of the women that were incarcerated, 63% of them were Māori. 92% of those charged with criminal offences of a serious kind were Māori women. The statistics, we all know the incarceration rates for men have always been around 50%, even though that's disproportionate in terms of the population numbers that Māori are. But these are real facts, and I think because of that case that the Waitangi Tribunal focused upon, we were able to highlight why the criminal justice system needs to be recreated, why there needs to be a real discussion about decarceration rather than incarceration rates, and why we need to be as a country looking at the fact that we need to be closing prisons rather than maintaining populations of prisons. Another case I did recently highlighting it is the failure of the Electoral Act to enable prisoner populations to vote. And notwithstanding the matter had gone all the way to the Supreme Court, we were eventually able to prove and then have it followed after Waitangi Tribunal that prisoners should have the right to vote. It's not a universal privilege, a right, it's still a privilege at the moment, so we're still working on that case. But let me turn now to what I wanted to talk about for today. I'm in the Waitangi Tribunal as part of an inquiry into the health services and outcomes process. It was an inquiry that largely arose because the funding model around which health services and delivery has been in place, we say, has marginalised and discriminated against providing equal access to health by Māori. The claim was initially brought by two national organisations, but a group that I was instructed to appear for is the Māori Nurses Association, and they came to me seeking some really specific help after a very hard, long battle. They were what I would say the activists who had been doing the action in isolation for a long time, but they were deserving of the same focus because of the injustices that they were confronting. They were a group of women, and their organisation, as the introduction said, is 43,000 women in the main. There are men in their organisation too, and significant numbers of those are Māori women. And significant numbers of the Māori women have chosen not to work for the DHBs or the public PHOs as they used to be. They have chosen to work for their tribal organisations or Māori providers. And why have they done that? Because as we all know, we need to have culturally safe services delivered. The best person that had advocated for that, and she's an inspiration to the Māori nurses movement, was the late Eri Hapiti Ramsden. She had ensured that the cultural safety courses were an integral, a foundational part, not just of any training for Māori, but for nurses generally. And of course, the natural extension of a culturally safe practice is that we develop service delivery that is inspired by, guided from, and accountable to tikanga Māori. So many Māori providers have set up to do that. But in the funding models that have been arranged, they haven't been given the same levels of funding for service delivery as the DHBs. The contract arrangements are really at the heart of our claim, but have been debilitating in a number of ways. And the claims that the Māori nurses wanted to highlight was about those issues. One of the key aspects of the claim was given in briefs of evidence, I just want to refer to them so I don't get it wrong, by really important witnesses for the nurses. They were the nurses themselves. They talked of their experiences in nursing, some as long as 50 years, of confronting personal racism on a daily basis, of being told by their own institutional managers not to say kia ora while they were working, not to address whānau, not to be flexible in the way they dealt with hard-to-reach families, how they had been prevented from advancement within the nursing profession because they were perceived as either too Māori or too much of a shit stirrer because they were Māori. And all of that evidence, which I think highlighted the much more fundamental disparity in power, which is what I really wanted to focus on today. And if you'll bear with me, I'm just trying to get the document up. Now, as part of their claim, they called on some really important Pākehā allies. And I want to talk about allies. We need to talk about this, you know. Pākehā allies, Asian allies, Pacific Island allies are absolutely fundamental to any movement for tino rangatiratanga. They aren't to be treated like second-class citizens by us either, Māori. I want to be really clear on this, because that's one of the things that worries me. You know, and it's really condescending for me to say, you know, some of my best friends are Pākehā. Well, it's more fundamental than that. My fathers are Pākehā. And so I need to just say to those that are listening here, and I'm really speaking to the Māori activists here, that we need to recognise the role that allies play in reaching our goals for change. And the Springbok tour, I suppose, is the best way where we kind of worked collaboratively, we got on well, we all got arrested together, we all went to jail together, we all became poor together, we all became hated together, we all became vilified together. But it's a bit harder when you're not got the spectre of that happening to see who your allies are when you're working in day-to-day life. And I, as a lawyer, have always been really careful to ensure that I pay respect to those allies. I don't think I'd have done the work that I've done without people like Jane Kelsey and David Williams. At a judicial level, I don't think we would have had the inspiration we had in some cases without the late Justice Gallen. I don't know if you know him, but Rodney spoke Māori. He grew up in Hastings. He was an enormous individual who was part of the Presbyterian Church, and he was a fundamental advocate for the peoples of Waikato Moana. He was a great judge for me. And then, of course, we've got the more high-profile ones with Chief Justice Elias. But they were important allies in our movement for change. In the contemporary context, The Asians for Tino Rangatiratanga, if you're listening out there, I want to say a big shout out to you. I just love protesting with you. You know, you are the best kind of ally for me when I'm on the front line. You keep me inspired. When we had those Canadians come over here that wanted to talk about all of the things they wanted to talk, you took the front foot. We didn't have to confront why would white people from over here try and tell us about the fascist policies. So Asians for Tino Rangatiratanga, I think you've got to be given a big ups in this new decolonisation phase. The writings from that group too, because it's the ideological information that comes from them, has really been helpful in bringing some of the contemporary analysis to how we achieve Tino Rangatiratanga. So I want to have a big ups to them in the contemporary scene as well. And I do want to say that it has been a worry for me that my age group seems to have gone to sleep. So we have an emerging vanguard from Action Station and from Just Speak that actually are confronting the day-to-day personal racism that used to be confronted a lot more by groups like CARE and Heart a long time ago. And it was like there was this 20-year gap. So I just wanted to have that as a, you know, just remember that our Pākehā allies are really important. They're not to be looked down upon. They're not our slaves, because that's one of the things that someone, you know, go and get your pet Pākehā, they used to call about it. I think Jamie Ballach wrote about them. Well, they're by no means anything pet for me. They're people I would die for. I fought shoulder to shoulder with on the front lines, and they've been in the back room with me cooking the kai and writing the submissions while everyone else sleeps. So I just think when we reflect on things over the next 2 weeks, we remember who our allies are, just as we remember who our enemies are. And our enemies sometimes are not just Pākehā or non-Māori. There's an enemy within. And that enemy within is our reluctance to accept tikanga Māori, for example, as a valuable contribution to the nation, as a separate law in its own right that can guide relationships to the well-being of this country. So anyhow, we had these Pākehā allies who assisted us in our case. And Heather's one of the ones that's the organiser of this conference. And I want to say, you know, they did this case for us with no payment. And that's the other thing, you know, quite often when you're doing movements for change as activists, there's this mythical expectation that money's going to drop from heaven, that resources are going to come from everywhere, that you're going to be able to get all the help you need just by standing up. Well, that's not true. It's the people that actually offer you the help with no expectation of financial or even personal gain. They do it ki te tautoko te kaupapa. And that's what I'm hoping that we can achieve here. And they wrote papers that were just absolutely brilliant. I mean, I didn't want to bore you. There was something like 30,000 pages of evidence that went through the Waitangi Tribunal. And there was about 10 briefs of evidence that touched on this. But there was all these policy documents from the Crown. But Heather managed to bring it all down to a couple of paragraphs. And she said, Māori nurses are critical to successful Māori outcomes for whānau hapua niwi, and are named as key stakeholders in contemporary health policy. Te Rau Kōkiri is the name of a long-standing campaign run by Te Runanga o Aotearoa for Māori nurses to receive equal pay for work of equal value. And can I say, when you say that to anyone, you say it to a minister, and we've said it to Minister Clark, Minister Henare, do you think that a Pākehā nurse should get paid the same money as a Māori nurse? Everyone says yes. Do you think a Pākehā or Māori nurse working for a Māori organisation should get paid the same money as a Pākehā or Māori nurse working for DHBs? They all say yes. They've known about it now for nearly 15 years, and nothing has changed. Now, what is the barrier to that? That's the most fundamental thing. The argument is they say it's the funding model. Or they say they give the money to the Māori providers and the Māori providers don't pass it on. So I want to pay a mihi to Moi Mill. this year after our case, Ngāti Hine heard this and they've made the change. They have passed it on. But sadly, all of the other Māori providers haven't followed suit. There's only one other Māori provider that's passed it on. The other 12 Māori providers that I checked up are still paying their nurses and their Māori practitioners in health the minimum wage. And in some cases, that's really a significant drop in pay. You can get $40 for the same job that you're getting $19 an hour for as the Māori provider. Now, we all know that just doesn't make sense. That's racist. That's unfair. That's gender discrimination. Everyone knows that. So we know it. Why can't they change it? What is the barriers to making the change? Heather went on to highlight all of the international law. She talked about the International Labour Organization 169, Article 20. She went down all the legal arguments. She went down to, she did a comparative analysis to show that even on the best case scenario, we were still getting paid Māori 25% less than others. Why is that? Is it because Māori care delivery is less important than other delivery? It's fundamental. It's because they see Māori service delivery as substandard, as secondary. They believe that there is this white lens, Donna Aue there talks about, you know, you're going into the whiteness of the health system. That whiteness suggests that they have a superior lens that enables them to give an inferior view to the way others are being treated. What I couldn't understand when I came into the case is this has been known now for 15 years. There hadn't been any formal findings. There hadn't been any formal findings on this, but nothing had changed. So what could I do to help them? Well, first thing we did, we organised a protest. Then Renee Mahi got in trouble, people, because out of those protests came certain statements from a man that has now gone to the High Court to accuse her of making incredibly racist assumptions about what he was saying, when we all know that the only racist in the room was the assumptions that had been made by him. So Renee's case became a focus of all of the inequity. So that was the protest. What else did the nurses do? They went to the United Nations. They met with Nanaia Mahuta over there, and she has been a great advocate from them. They came home and they tried to have meetings with the Crown again, but no meetings crystallised for 5 years. So we went to the tribunal. We got findings from the tribunal after all of this evidence from Kiri Nuku, from all of the nurses, and I don't want to personalise them here because I think they deserve the privacy of their personal stories being respected. But their stories were real. Nurses living in cars because they can't pay rent while they work for their iwi. Nurses who pay the pharmacy bills for the whānau in the iwi because those people are too pohara. So they go without so that their mothers and aunties and nannies can have access to pharmaceuticals. Nurses who have been actually on the brink of suicide because of the personal racism they've confronted for the things that they do. And all of this testimony came before the tribunal. And what has really been, I think, the most sad thing is that after 13 years of letter writing, of direct action, of looking at allies, of getting a moral understanding in the communities, there's still no action. So what do we have to do in this forum? What do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to collectivise our position, and we need to confront policymakers, and we need to make it really clear that co-design of the funding model is fundamental. They can no longer design things without us at the table making decisions. At a next level, DHBs, you must pay your nurses. Some of these DHBs, by the way, are so archaic, they pay men more than women. I could not believe this, but the statistics bear this out. So having a raho seems to mean more 2 days than having something else. That's not on. And then if you look at the analysis of the inequity again, they still are treating Māori women as second-class citizens, and we must confront that. The second thing, third thing that we need to do is we need to go and lobby our Māori communities to make sure they're good employers, that they are treating Māori nurses in the same way as they expected. And we have to ask some of these CEOs that are on 200 and 300,000 to take a pay cut. I'm really serious about this. They've got to look at equitable funding across the board. But more fundamentally, and I come back to the beginning because I know I'm being told to wind up, we need to decolonise our minds. We need to have strategies of decolonisation. We need not to fear but support activists and activism. We need to be allies for change. You don't have to be the one that's at the front with the big mouth and the foghorn. You can be the one at the back writing the pen, making the cakes, doing the fundraising. You need to be there physically to support them. But more fundamentally, you need to believe in the goals of social justice, and you need to give effect to the politics of kindness, manaakitanga, and kaitiakitanga. They're things that are lived and breathed daily. They're not notional things. And if I think anything I can leave with us as we talk over the next 14 days, is that that isn't something that's abstract. It's not something that the government possesses. It's something that's born in us. We need to nurture that, share that, and hopefully, and I was hoping that Penny Henare would be here today, and I was hoping that Nanaya might be listening on the internet. You can make a priority to get us to be treated as equal citizens of equal worth in a country that is ours. So on that note, I think that's all I wanted to say. Lots more to say on this topic, could go all afternoon, but I'm hoping that I have, first of all, I'm hoping that I've done justice to the Māori nurses who I know are watching this presentation tonight. Kia ora.
As you were talking, I remember when we had a big hui, and the title of the hui was "The Answers Lie Within Us." And one of the nurses had asked me to write their speech. She was doing the presentation, she asked me to write it. As I was writing the speech, what became really, really important there to recognise that we talk about the answers lie within us. I came to see, and so do the demons. And colonisation really stuffs up our thinking and our minds. And so, as nurses, it's actually really, really difficult to get out of that mindset. So when you were talking about activism, and I'm thinking of the quiet activism of Māori nurses, and like right now in this coronavirus incidents that we're actually having to cope with, the people who are keeping our people safe are the Māori nurses. And so, ka mihi nui kia koe, I roto i tērā whakaaro. One of the questions that has been posed was how it's actually almost a challenge to where does the power of ngā mea Māori lie? And the question was, how can we actually, how can the government actually change the way they fund any kaupapa Māori activity when they keep saying, oh, it's all got to be hapu-led or iwi-led, and there are a lot of Māori who live outside of those institutions. So that's the first question. The second question, I'll ask you both of them at once, because I know they go one into the other. This one was, you talked about Pākehā being allies. And the question is, how can Pākehā understand to be an ally when they are fighting for their privilege in white institutions? E rua wena Pākehā. Need the mic?
I'll take the second one first. Giving up power is how Pākehā who are allies, they'll tell you, they aren't afraid to give up power. They aren't an ally if they don't want to give up power. So they are, if they're still fighting for the privilege of their positions in institutions, then they need to be challenged as to whether in fact they're on the kaupapa or they actually into a personal advancement off the backs of Māori. And we've all had examples of that. But the first question I think is the fundamental one, but it's not a hard one. We've been denied the right to make decisions for ourselves for a long time by the process of colonisation, and one is Jackson is speaking following me, but when he describes tino rangatiratanga, he says there are several facets to it. One of them is to the power to make decisions between and amongst us as Māori. And there is no forums at the moment for us to make those decisions of toha between us. The person that holds the power to make the decision of whether it goes to John Tamihere's Whānau Ora, or it goes to Ngāti Hene Health, or it comes to the Nunga Ngāti Pikiao, is the health officials themselves. So if you're serious about that, then the co-design and power decision making at the funding model should be based on a shared power position where Māori then work together to develop options for that. The question about white privilege and privileging of our position is something that also needs to be said to Māori in the system. Many people are holding positions of power to their white masters, and they need to really ask themselves whether in fact they need to be reshaping the systems that they are being asked to contract under to be more kaupapa Māori fundamental than kāwanatanga developed. So I think those are the two practical strategies. Can we do it? Yes. Have we been given the opportunity to do it? No. And that's really what I think is at the heart of the claim. The tribunal has recommended that those two matters change.
So while this conversation ends right now because there's time restriction, because of the kaupapa we're on, a conversation doesn't stop. And the worrying all this conversation for me right now is to tātou kaha mahi kia Māori mai e ngā mea katoa e ngā motu haki turu ko rāka me kūra mai na me pia. So all the way to the Māori business that we're doing all over these years, the people who make the decision is still not Māori. So I roto I tēnā ngā mihi tui kia i hai mai I roto I tēnā kaupapa tēnā koe.
Thank you.